The freezing wind whipping across the Montana train platform was cruel enough to strip the warmth from a person's soul. But it was nothing compared to the icy stares of the townsfolk. Evelina stood trembling beside her single battered trunk. She looked terribly small, her threadbare gray morning dress offering zero protection against the biting cold or the swirling whispers of judgment. She clutched a cracked tortoise-shell hair comb deep inside her pocket. It was the only piece of her old life she had left. The station master sneered, openly mocking her delicate state, loudly declaring that a broken city widow would not last a week in this brutal country. She lowered her head. The silence that followed was heavy and cruel. Then, the wooden floorboards of the platform groaned under an immense weight. A towering shadow fell over her tiny frame. Callahan stepped out of the swirling snow. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders blocking out the harsh wind entirely. He did not speak a single word to the sneering station master. His steely eyes locked onto the cruel man with such crushing, silent authority that the station master physically stepped back. Callahan reached down, his massive hand effortlessly lifting her heavy trunk as if it were made of pure air. The message was unmistakable. She belonged to him now, and heaven help anyone who dared to look at her the wrong way again. Now, before we ride further out into that freezing Montana night, Moat want to invite you to take a quick second to like this video and subscribe. It really helps keep these stories flowing, just like a warm hearth in a bitter winter. All right, let us go back to Evelina and that towering shadow of a man who just changed her entire world with a single glance. The wagon ride out of town was a journey through a white, howling purgatory. The wind tore across the plains with a viciousness that felt entirely personal, screaming through the wooden slats of the buckboard and biting through Evelina's threadbare morning dress as if it were made of paper. She sat rigidly on the hard wooden seat, her delicate frame shivering so violently that her teeth chattered in a painful, irregular rhythm. She tried to make herself as small as possible, a survival habit ingrained in her from months of existing in spaces where her very presence was treated as a nuisance. Beside her sat Callahan. He drove the team of massive draft horses with a quiet, effortless command. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He just stared straight ahead into the blinding swirl of snow, his enormous, broad-shouldered frame absorbing the brunt of the freezing wind. He was like a living mountain, a windbreak of muscle and heavy canvas. Evelina kept her head bowed, terrified of what this silent giant might demand of her. The men in her past, the creditors, the so-called family friends who had swooped in after her husband's tragic passing, had all been loud. They had demanded, they had threatened, they had taken every last ounce of her dignity. This massive man's silence was entirely new, and in her fragile state, the unknown was utterly terrifying. Suddenly, Callahan pulled back on the heavy leather reins. The wagon lurched to a halt in the middle of the desolate, snow-blind prairie. Evelina gasped, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird. Panic seized her throat. Was this it? Was he going to leave her out here? Had he realized how utterly useless and broken she was, just like the station master had declared? She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the harsh words, the cruel rejection. She waited for the inevitable abandonment. Instead, she heard the heavy rustle of thick wool and animal hide. A sudden, immense weight dropped over her trembling shoulders. She opened her eyes, startled. Callahan had stripped off his own massive, fur-lined winter coat and draped it completely over her tiny form. The coat was so large it practically swallowed her whole, dropping all the way down to her snow-dusted boots. The heavy garment was radiating an incredible, life-saving heat. It smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and the deep, comforting scent of clean, weathered leather. Evelina looked up, her hazel eyes wide with pure shock. Callahan was now sitting in just his thick flannel shirt and heavy suspenders, completely exposed to the biting frost. He did not offer a single word of explanation. He simply picked up the reins, clicked his tongue to the horses, and set the wagon back into motion. Inside the massive cocoon of his coat, Evelina stopped shivering. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark of warmth touched her frozen soul. They rode for another agonizing hour before the shape of a homestead finally emerged from the whiteout. It was a sturdy, low-slung cabin built of massive, hand-hewn logs. nestled tightly against a protective outcropping of dark rock. It looked exactly like the man who owned it, immovable, silent, and built to withstand any storm the world could throw at it. When the wagon rolled to a stop, Evelina immediately began struggling to untangle herself from the heavy coat, desperate to prove her worth, terrified of being seen as idle. But before her frozen boots could even touch the icy ground, Callahan was there. He reached up with hands so large they could easily crush a man's skull and simply lifted her down from the high seat. He did not grab her roughly. He held her by the waist with a terrifying, absolute gentleness, as if he were handling the most fragile piece of spun glass. He set her down on the porch, out of the deep snow, and turned back to haul her heavy trunk onto his shoulder, as if it weighed absolutely nothing. The inside of the cabin was dark and possessed a biting chill, but it was immaculately clean. Callahan kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them, instantly cutting off the shrieking wind. The silence that fell over the room was heavy and profound. He pointed a massive, calloused finger toward a sturdy wooden chair near the stone hearth, a silent command for her to sit. Evelina obeyed instantly, perching nervously on the very edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched with wide, hyper-vigilant eyes as the giant moved around the small space. He was incredibly graceful for a man of his immense size. Within minutes, a fire was roaring in the deep stone fireplace, casting a rich, golden light across the rough-hewn floorboards and driving back the creeping blue shadows. The warmth began to wash over her in aching waves. Her frozen fingers began to throb as the blood finally returned to them. Evelina's breathing hitched. The silence was stretching too long. The overwhelming urge to justify her existence, to apologize for being a burden, bubbled up in her throat. She reached a trembling hand into her pocket and pulled out the only thing she owned that held any personal value, a cracked tortoiseshell hair comb. She meant to smooth her tangled, wind-whipped chestnut hair, to try and make herself look presentable, to look like the proper lady she used to be before the world had shattered her. But her fingers were still numb and clumsy. The comb slipped. It clattered loudly against the wooden floorboards, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Evelina froze. The breath completely vanished from her lungs. In the grand, wealthy houses of her past, dropping something, making a mess, displaying any form of physical weakness, had always resulted in immediate, sneering reprimands. She instinctively squeezed her eyes shut and shrank back against the chair, waiting for the heavy boots to storm over, waiting for the harsh, booming voice to demand what was wrong with her. She waited for the mockery. She heard the floorboards groan under his massive weight. The heavy footsteps stopped directly in front of her, but the angry shout never came. Evelina slowly opened one terrified eye. Callahan was kneeling in front of her. A man who stood well over 6.5 feet tall, a man who looked like he could wrestle a grizzly bear and win, was down on one knee on the hard floor. He reached out with a hand the size of a dinner plate. His thick, scarred fingers brushed against the floorboards and picked up the fragile, cracked piece of tortoise shell. The comb looked absurdly tiny, incredibly delicate, resting in his massive, calloused palm. He didn't ask why she was holding it. He didn't demand to know why it was cracked. He just looked at it for a long, quiet moment. Then, very slowly, he raised his intense, steely blue eyes to meet hers. There was no pity in his gaze. There was no irritation. There was only a deep, anchoring calm. He gently wiped a speck of hearth dust from the comb with his thick thumb, taking excruciating care not to break it further, and held it out to her. Evelina reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough, warm skin of his hand. A jolt of pure, unexpected electricity ran up her arm. She took the comb, clutching it tightly to her chest. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to explain the tragic story behind the crack in the shell, to pour out the horrifying truth of why she had fled the city and thrown herself into the terrifying void of a mail-order bride advertisement. But her throat was locked tight. The trauma of her past was a heavy, suffocating chain around her neck. Callahan did not push her. He simply gave her a single, firm nod, rose to his full, towering height, and turned back to the cast-iron stove to prepare a meal. That first evening passed in a surreal, hushed rhythm. He set a tin plate of steaming venison stew in front of her, along with a thick slice of fresh, crusty bread. Evelina ate as if she were starving, because in many ways, she was. But even as the rich, hot food warmed her from the inside out, her mind was a spinning vortex of anxiety. Why was he being so kind? What was the catch? People were not kind to destitute widows. They extracted payment. They always extracted payment. She watched him covertly from under her dark eyelashes. He ate silently, his massive shoulders hunched over the small table. He looked dangerous, a man forged by isolation and brutal winters. Yet, every action he took around her was carefully measured, deliberately softened. When the night fully settled in, and the wind outside began to scream with a renewed demonic fury, Callahan stood up. He walked over to the only bed in the cabin, a sturdy wooden frame tucked into a cozy corner near the hearth, piled high with thick woolen blankets and soft furs. He pulled back the covers, ensuring it was ready. Then, without a single word, he walked to the far side of the room, unrolled a thick canvas sleeping mat directly across the heavy oak door, and sat down. He was literally positioning his massive body as a physical barricade between her and the outside world. He was giving her the only comfortable bed in the house, choosing the freezing, drafty floor to ensure her safety. Evelina sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the broad expanse of his back. A lump the size of a stone formed in her throat. She carefully slipped out of her damp boots and crawled under the heavy furs. The scent of pine and clean mountain air surrounded her. She lay in the flickering firelight, listening to the ferocious storm battering the log walls. She was a woman running from a horrific secret, a truth so ugly she was certain it would make this honorable man turn her out into the snow the moment he discovered it. She clutched the cracked comb under her pillow, her heart aching with a desperate, terrifying hope. For the first time in years, she closed her eyes and felt a strange alien sensation. Vekepa et hot over her exhausted body. She felt safe. But safety is a fragile illusion for a woman carrying ghosts. The morning broke with a blinding, crystalline sunlight that reflected fiercely off the snowdrifts piling against the windows. Evelina woke up Vekepa hot, a sharp gasp, the lingering shadows of a nightmare clinging to her mind. She sat up, clutching the heavy furs to her chest. The cabin was warm, the fire already stoked and crackling merrily. But the room was empty. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted bitter on her tongue. Had he left? Had he changed his mind in the cold light of day? She threw off the blankets, her bare feet hitting the rough floorboards. She practically ran to the small, frosted window and rubbed away the condensation. Outside, in the biting morning air, Callahan was splitting firewood. He had stripped off his heavy coat, working in just his shirt and suspenders, despite the freezing temperature. The sheer, raw power of the man was mesmerizing. He swung the massive iron maul with a terrifying, rhythmic ease, bringing it down to shatter the thick pine logs with a deafening crack. Every time the heavy blade struck, the muscles in his broad back and thick shoulders bunched and rolled. Evelina pressed her small, delicate hands against the freezing glass, unable to look away. He was a force of nature, untamed and deeply intimidating. Yet she remembered the unbelievable gentleness of those same massive hands, holding her broken comb just hours before. She quickly dressed, smoothing the wrinkles from her threadbare morning dress, desperate to find some way to be useful, to earn the incredible kindness he had shown her. She moved to the small kitchen area, intending to clean the tin plates from the night before. As she reached for a rag near the wash basin, her eye caught something sitting on the corner of the heavy wooden table. It was a plate. It was a tea cup. It was a piece of paper. Evelina's heart stopped dead in her chest. The blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the snow outside. She recognized the thick, expensive, cream-colored parchment instantly. She recognized the sharp, aggressive black ink of the handwriting scrawled across the front. It was the letter. The final, damning letter from the man who had destroyed her life back east. The letter that detailed the exact horrific lies they had used to ruin her reputation, the very secret she had fled 1,000 miles to escape. It must have slipped from the false bottom of her battered trunk when Callahan had carried it inside. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. If he read that letter, he would know everything. He would believe the vicious lies. He would look at her not with that quiet, grounding calm, but with the same disgust and hatred she had endured for a year. She lunged forward, desperate to snatch the terrible parchment off the table and throw it straight into the blazing hearth. But just as her trembling fingertips brushed the edge of the paper, the heavy iron latch of the front door clicked loudly. The heavy oak swung open, letting in a swirl of icy wind and bright sunlight. Callahan stepped through the frame, filling the entire doorway, his massive chest heaving slightly from his labor. He stopped. His piercing blue eyes immediately locked onto her terrified face, and then dropped slowly, deliberately, to the damning piece of cream-colored parchment, trembling in her hand. Have you ever experienced a moment so terrifying that the entire world simply stopped spinning? The kind of absolute, paralyzing dread where the air suddenly turns into thick, unbreathable water, and the only sound left in the universe is the frantic, deafening hammering of your own pulse echoing against your ribs. That is exactly where Evelina stood in the pale morning light of that isolated Montana cabin. The cream-colored parchment trembled violently in her delicate pale fingers, the sharp black ink glaring up. Mote her, like a venomous snake ready to strike. The heavy oak door had just swung shut. They kept a resounding thud, sealing her inside with the towering, massively built mountain man who had offered her sanctuary just hours before. Callahan stood frozen just inside the threshold, his immense chest heaving slowly from the physical labor of splitting massive pine logs in the bitter frost. The freezing wind that had followed him inside swirled around his heavy boots, but the chill in the room had nothing to do with the winter weather. His piercing, steely blue eyes were locked completely onto the damning letter clutched in her hand, the very letter that detailed every vicious, horrifying lie her deceased husband's family had fabricated to destroy her life. This was the moment she had been dreading since she boarded that westbound train. This was the exact second the illusion of safety would shatter, the moment this quiet, honorable giant would read the poison penned by her abusers, realize she was a ruined, destitute pariah, and cast her back out into the freezing, unforgiving wilderness. Evelina physically shrank backward, her slender shoulders hitting the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. She looked as fragile as a winter branch, about to snap under the weight of a heavy snowfall. The urge to run, to apologize frantically, to beg for mercy, swelled so tightly in her throat that she could taste the bitter copper of raw panic. In her tragic past, making a mistake, hiding a secret, or simply existing in the wrong space had always been met with cruel, sneering reprimands and psychological torment. She squeezed her haunted hazel eyes shut, her knuckles turning bone white, as she crushed the edge of the parchment, bracing her delicate frame for the booming voice of righteous anger. She waited for him to snatch the paper from her hands. She waited for the disgust to twist his stoic features. She waited for the inevitable end of her temporary salvation. The heavy floorboards groaned. The sound of massive leather-clad boots taking slow, deliberate steps echoed through the suffocating silence of the cabin. Evelina flinched, shrinking even smaller into herself, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped. The overpowering scent of fresh-cut pine, wood smoke, and freezing ozone washed over her. Callahan was standing so close, his towering frame blocked out the morning sunlight completely, casting her in a vast, protective shadow. She slowly forced her terrified eyes open, expecting to see a towering inferno of judgment. Instead, she found him looking down at her with an expression of such profound, anchoring calm that it completely short-circuited her panic. He did not look at the letter. He did not demand an explanation. He simply reached out with a hand so massive and deeply calloused it could have easily crushed her slender wrist, and gently, agonizingly slowly, wrapped his thick fingers over hers. The heat radiating from his massive palm was shocking against her freezing skin. He applied no pressure, no force. He simply held her trembling hand within his giant one, a silent, immovable physical anchor in the middle of her raging emotional storm. He slowly lowered his head, catching her terrified, tear-filled gaze, holding her focus entirely on his steady blue eyes. He gently slid the crumpled parchment from her rigid fingers. The paper looked absurdly small, almost comical, trapped within his massive grasp. Evelina choked on a sob, her heart dropping into her stomach as she watched him turn toward the roaring stone hearth. This was it. He was going to hold it to the light, read the venomous accusations, and realize the fragile woman he had brought into his home was entirely worthless. But Callahan did not unfold the paper. He did not spare a single glance at the aggressive black ink detailing her supposed madness and thievery. Without a moment of hesitation, without a single flicker of curiosity, he extended his massive arm over the open flames and dropped the cream-colored parchment directly into the heart of the roaring fire. Evelina gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure, unadulterated shock. She watched, paralyzed, as the edges of the thick, expensive paper curled and blackened, the flames greedily consuming the venomous lies that had chased her across the country. The sharp, aggressive handwriting blistered and vanished into gray ash within seconds. The heavy chain of terror that had been suffocating her for an entire year suddenly shattered. The sheer magnitude of his absolute, unquestioning trust hit her delicate system like a physical blow. Her knees buckled beneath her slight frame. Before she could collapse onto the hard wooden floorboards, Callahan moved with a terrifying, breathtaking speed. His massive arms caught her instantly, scooping her fragile weight up against his broad, muscular chest as easily as if she weighed absolutely nothing. He carried her the short distance to the heavy wooden chair beside the hearth, settling her down with a gentleness that brought a fresh wave of stinging tears to her haunted eyes. The dam holding back her agonizing trauma finally broke. The silent stoicism she had maintained for months shattered into a million jagged pieces. "Believe me," the desperate, agonizing whisper tore from her throat, a fragile sound completely engulfed by the crackling of the fire. She looked up at the towering mountain man standing beside her, the tears finally spilling over her dark eyelashes and tracing wet, shimmering paths down her pale cheeks. She begged him to understand, the words tumbling out of her in a broken, rushing river of confessed pain. She poured out the horrific, shared secret she had carried alone for far too long. She spoke of her late husband, a kind but weak man who had succumbed to a sudden fever, leaving her entirely at the mercy of his wealthy, cruel older brother. She described the immediate, chilling shift in the family dynamics, the way her brother-in-law had manufactured vicious lies, claiming she was mentally unstable, claiming she had stolen family heirlooms, all to legally strip away her rightful inheritance. She choked on a ragged sob as she described the utter humiliation of being thrown out of the grand estate, with absolute nothing but the threadbare mourning clothes on her back, the way high society had sneered and turned a blind eye, leaving her completely destitute and terrified on the freezing city streets. Callahan stood perfectly still beside the stone hearth, listening in absolute, unbroken silence. He did not interrupt her hat empty platitudes. He did not offer useless words of pity. He stood as immovable as a granite cliff, absorbing the full, horrifying weight of her tragedy. But beneath his stoic, silent exterior, a terrifying transformation was taking place. The muscles in his incredibly broad shoulders began to bunch and coil like heavy steel cables under his thick flannel shirt. His massive jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles jumped beneath his dark, weathered beard. Evelina watched through her tears as his giant hands, resting at his sides, slowly balled into fists of absolute devastating power. The thick leather of his work gloves actually groaned under the immense strain, his knuckles turning a stark, bone white. The protective fury radiating from his towering frame was almost a tangible force in the small cabin, a silent, seething rage that made the very air feel incredibly heavy. He was not angry at her. The fury burning behind his steely blue eyes was entirely violently directed at the ghosts of her past, at the cruel, faceless men who had dared to break the fragile, beautiful creature sitting in his home. It was a deeply intimidating display of raw masculine power. Yet, for the first time in her life, Evelina was not afraid of the danger. She realized, with a profound, earth-shattering clarity, that this massive, dangerous man was completely, entirely on her side. His imposing authority, his immense size, his terrifying strength. It was all an impenetrable shield, standing firmly between her and the cruelty of the world. When her tears finally slowed to quiet, exhausted hiccups, the silence in the cabin stretched out, heavy and deeply peaceful. Callahan did not speak. The massive mountain man simply turned away, his massive boots carrying him quietly to the small wash basin. He wet a clean, soft cloth with warm water from the kettle, wrung it out gently, and returned to her side. He knelt down in front of her again, his towering frame folding onto the hard floorboards, bringing his steely blue eyes completely level with hers. With an excruciating, breathtaking tenderness that entirely contradicted his massive calloused hands, he reached out and gently wiped the tear tracks from her pale, fragile cheeks. He did not press for more details. He did not ask her what she planned to do next. His actions spoke volumes louder than any words ever could. He was telling her, without a single syllable, that her past was dead ashes in his fireplace, that the cruel men of the East had absolutely no power within these log walls, and that she was deeply, intrinsically worthy of being cared for. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, profoundly healing rhythm. For the first time in over a year, the crippling hypervigilance that had ruled Evelina's existence began to slowly fade. She found herself watching Callahan as he moved around the cabin, repairing a broken leather harness, tending to the iron stove, his immense presence filling the space with a deeply comforting gravity. The extreme contrast between his terrifying physical power and his deliberate, respectful distance fascinated her. He was providing a fiercely protected safe space, but he was intentionally giving her the room to breathe, to simply exist without the constant pressure of expectation. She found herself reaching into her pocket, tracing the cracked edges of the tortoiseshell comb, the object that had once symbolized her brokenness. Now, sitting in the warm golden light of the hearth, knowing he had held that very comb with such gentle reverence, the crack did not seem like a flaw anymore. It felt like a testament to survival. By the third morning, the brutal winter storm finally broke, leaving the Montana prairie buried under a blindingly bright, unbroken ocean of pure white snow. The sky was an aggressive, crystalline blue, the air so cold it felt sharp against the lungs. The silence of the isolated homestead was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic stamping of the massive draft horses as Callahan hitched them to the wooden sleigh. They were entirely out of flour, coffee, and basic supplies. Furthermore, Callahan had silently noticed the way her delicate frame shivered in the drafty corners of the cabin, realizing her threadbare mourning clothes were wildly insufficient for the brutal frontier winter. A trip into town was entirely unavoidable. Evelina stood on the porch, wrapped completely in his massive fur-lined coat, the heavy garment dwarfing her slight figure entirely. A cold knot of anxiety instantly tightened in her stomach at the prospect of leaving the sanctuary of the cabin. The town represented society, judgment, and the cruel stares she had miraculously escaped for 3 days. She dreaded facing the sneering station master, the whispering women in the mercantile, the harsh reality of a world that viewed fragile things as completely disposable. But as Callahan lifted her effortlessly into the sleigh, his massive hand resting briefly, reassuringly on her waist, she drew a deep, trembling breath. She was not the same terrified, broken woman who had arrived on that freezing train platform. She was under the protection of a man who commanded the very environment he walked through. The sleigh ride across the glittering white plains was swift and incredibly cold. The wind whipped at her cheeks, painting them a vibrant, healthy pink, the fresh air slowly chasing the lingering ghosts from her mind. Callahan drove the team with his usual, silent expertise, his towering frame sitting rigidly beside her, acting as a permanent, physical barrier against the biting chill. As the rough, snow-dusted buildings of the frontier town slowly materialized on the horizon, Evelina instinctively pulled the collar of the massive coat tighter around her delicate neck, bracing herself for the inevitable onslaught of hostile eyes. The main street was a chaotic, muddy rut of wagon wheels and melting snow. As the heavy sleigh pulled to a halt in front of the large wooden mercantile, the atmosphere on the boardwalk instantly shifted. Men in heavy canvas dusters and women wrapped in thick woolen shawls stopped dead in their tracks. The casual frontier chatter died away into a heavy, suffocating silence. The entire town was staring. They stared at the terrifyingly large, reclusive rancher, who rarely came down from the mountain, and they stared with unabashed, cruel curiosity at the strikingly beautiful, incredibly delicate woman, swathed in his massive coat, sitting beside him. Evelina kept her head bowed, the familiar, suffocating weight of societal judgment threatening to crush the tiny spark of self-worth she had cultivated over the past few days. Callahan stepped down from the sleigh, his heavy boots hitting the boardwalk with a resounding thud that seemed to echo through the silent street. He turned, offering his massive hand to her. The moment her small, delicate fingers wrapped around his thick, calloused palm, the townspeople began to whisper. The harsh, judgmental hisses carried clearly on the crisp winter air. They mocked her fragile appearance. They speculated wildly about her virtue. They openly questioned why a giant like Callahan would burden himself. Ve kepaite, hot, such a useless, broken city bird. Every cruel word was a tiny, sharp dagger aimed directly at her newly healing heart. But Callahan did not flinch. He did not hurry her inside. He stood at his full, terrifying height, sweeping his piercing, steely blue eyes across the gathered crowd, with such an immense, crushing aura of dangerous authority that the whispers instantly choked in their throats. People physically stepped backward, completely intimidated by the silent, towering protector, daring anyone to say another word. He escorted her into the dimly lit mercantile with absolute, unwavering respect, entirely ignoring the hostile stares of the shopkeeper. The store smelled of tanned leather, roasted coffee beans, and dusty peppermint. Callahan moved methodically through the aisles, ordering sacks of flour, heavy woolen blankets, and to Evelina's quiet astonishment, several yards of high-quality, thick blue woolen fabric and matching sturdy winter boots entirely in her exact, delicate size. He was not just buying supplies, he was fiercely outfitting her for survival, investing in her future within his world. Evelina stood quietly near the heavy iron stove in the center of the room, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, profound gratitude that made her chest physically ache. The shopkeeper, a sour-faced man with a cruel, calculating sneer, loudly tallied the bill, deliberately banging the tin goods onto the wooden counter in a petty display of disrespect toward the unusual pair. Just as Callahan reached into his heavy canvas trousers to retrieve his leather coin purse, the brass bell above the mercantile door jingled aggressively. The heavy wooden door slammed open, letting in a bitter gust of wind, and the town's bustling, notoriously gossipy postmaster. He was waving a small yellow piece of paper in his gloved hand, his eyes immediately locking onto Callahan's towering frame, before darting to Evelina's delicate figure, standing near the stove. The postmaster's lips twisted into a cruel, knowing smirk that made the blood instantly freeze in Evelina's veins. He slapped the yellow paper down onto the wooden counter, directly in front of the massive mountain man, his voice booming far too loudly, intentionally projecting to every single hostile ear, lingering in the dusty store. Well, Mr. Callahan, the postmaster sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Looks like your quiet little arrangement up on the ridge ain't so quiet anymore. A telegraph just came through on the wire from back east. Urgent dispatch. It ain't for you, though, it's addressed to a highly wanted woman matching the exact description of the pretty little fragile thing hiding in your coat. You ever notice how silence can be louder than a gunshot? When that postmaster slapped the yellow telegraph paper onto the wooden counter, all the ambient noise in that dusty mercantile simply evaporated. The casual shuffling of boots, the low hum of frontier gossip, the crackle of the heavy iron stove, it all just ceased to exist. The air in the room instantly turned as thick and suffocating as wet wool. Evelina stood completely frozen near the heat of the iron stove, but she could not feel an ounce of warmth. The blood in her veins had turned to absolute ice. Her large, haunted hazel eyes were fixed on that garish yellow piece of paper resting on the scarred wood. She kanoe cape exactly what it was. She did not need to read the words. The cruel, wealthy brother-in-law she had fled back east was not a man who ever allowed his possessions to escape, and in his twisted mind, her reputation and her complete subjugation were entirely his property. The townspeople crowding the aisles leaned in, their faces twisted with an ugly, starving curiosity. They were practically vibrating with the malicious thrill of watching a fragile woman's total destruction unfold in real time. They hated her beauty, they hated her mystery, and most of all, they hated that the terrifying, untouchable giant of the mountain had deemed her worthy of his protection. Now, they finally had their ammunition. The postmaster puffed out his chest, completely emboldened by the cruel audience surrounding him. He tapped a dirty, gloved finger aggressively against the telegraph. The sharp, abrasive sound echoed like a death knell in Evelina's ears. He began to loudly declare the contents, intentionally projecting his voice so every hostile man and woman in the store could savor the venom. He sneered about a wealthy family back in Boston looking for a runaway widow. He used words like unstable, deeply troubled, and legally bound. Every single syllable was a calculated strike designed to strip away the tiny, fragile layers of dignity Evelina had managed to wrap around herself over the last 3 days. The suffocating weight of her past trauma crashed down on her slender frame so violently. She physically swayed on her feet. The instinct to make herself utterly invisible, to shrink down and beg for mercy, roared to life inside her panicked mind. She pulled the thick, fur-lined collar of Callahan's massive coat up around her pale cheeks, wishing the heavy leather would completely swallow her whole. She waited for the inevitable realization to hit the giant standing beside the counter. She waited for the stoic mountain man to finally look at her, with the same disgust and suspicion radiating from the townspeople. She waited to be discarded. But Callahan did not look at her. He did not turn around to demand the truth. The massive, towering rancher remained facing the counter, his incredibly broad shoulders completely blocking the postmaster's line of sight to her delicate figure. The terrifying stillness that fell over his enormous frame was not the paralysis of shock. It was the deadly, calculating calm of a predator, assessing a deeply annoying, entirely insignificant threat. The muscles across his back bunched beneath his thick wool flannel, turning his massive torso into an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and bone. The postmaster's cruel, gloating voice slowly faltered. The man's arrogant sneer began to crack and dissolve as he finally looked up, realizing the sheer, colossal magnitude of the man he was attempting to provoke. Callahan did not speak a single word. He did not raise his voice, and he certainly did not resort to the crude, physical violence a lesser man might have employed. He simply leaned forward, placing 2 hands the size of dinner plates flat onto the wooden counter. The thick timber actually groaned under his immense weight. He lowered his head, bringing his deeply tanned, bearded face terrifyingly close to the postmaster's pale, sweating brow. Callahan locked his piercing, steely blue eyes directly onto the smaller man's terrified gaze. The mountain man's stare was a physical weight, a crushing, silent promise of absolute devastation if another word was spoken against the woman behind him. It was an imposing authority so pure, so incredibly raw and uncompromising, that the postmaster physically recoiled, knocking his hip painfully against the brass weighing scales in his desperate haste to back away. The entire mercantile held its breath, trapped in the gravitational pull of the giantess' silent fury. With a slow, deliberate movement that held nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt, Callahan reached out and picked up the yellow telegraph paper. He did not read it. He did not give a single damn what lies the wealthy cowards back east had paid to transmit across the country. He crushed the crisp paper into a tight, insignificant little ball within his massive, calloused fist. He dropped the crumpled yellow trash onto the floorboards and deliberately stepped his heavy, scuffed leather boot directly onto it, grinding it into the muddy floor. The message was unequivocally clear. The opinions of the East Coast, the vicious gossip of the town, the legal threats of her abusers, they were all completely meaningless dirt beneath his boots. He pulled a heavy silver coin from his leather pouch, dropping it onto the counter to pay for the towering stack of supplies, completely ignoring the now trembling shopkeeper. He turned away from the counter, his immense physical presence parting the crowd of hostile onlookers like a massive ship cutting through fragile ice. Nobody dared to breathe, let alone speak. He walked directly to where Evelina stood shivering near the stove. The terrifying, dangerous aura radiating from him vanished the absolute second. His steely blue eyes found her pale, terrified face. With a breathtaking gentleness that defied his immense size, he rested his massive hand lightly between her shoulder blades, physically shielding her delicate frame from the harsh stares of the town, and quietly guided her out the heavy oak door and into the biting, pristine winter air. The sleigh ride back up the mountain was a study in profound, agonizing silence. The aggressive, crystalline blue sky of the morning had surrendered to the bruised purple and deep indigo hues of the approaching twilight. The freezing wind whipped across the snow-blind prairie with a renewed, shrieking vengeance, but Evelina barely felt the physical cold. Her internal world was completely consumed by a roaring inferno of guilt and terror. She sat rigidly beside the towering mountain man, staring blindly at the massive, rhythmic swaying of the draft horses. The rhythmic jingling of the harness bells felt like a countdown to her inevitable doom. She had told him her tragic secret. He had burned the letter. He had stood as an immovable shield between her and the cruel town. But this was different. This was not a piece of paper hiding in a trunk. This was a public hunt. Her brother-in-law was wealthy, relentless, and possessed a deeply cruel pride. He would not simply let her vanish, especially not when she carried the terrifying truth of his financial manipulations. By allowing Callahan to protect her, by staying in his isolated cabin, she was dragging a deeply honorable, innocent man into a vicious, high society war he did not deserve. She covertly glanced up at his stoic, weathered profile. His thick dark beard was dusted with frost, his piercing eyes focused entirely on navigating the treacherous, snow-covered trail. He looked so incredibly solid, a man completely at peace with the brutal frontier that surrounded him. He asked nothing of the world, and he bothered no one. How could she possibly repay his profound, unbelievable kindness by making him a target for the venomous reach of her past? The guilt was a physical, suffocating pressure in her throat. She was a broken, destitute widow. She possessed absolutely nothing of value. She was a fragile liability, a magnet for cruelty, and she realized with a completely shattered heart that the only honorable thing left for her to do was to leave. She had to disappear before the telegraphs turned into private detectives, before the whispers turned into warrants, before this beautiful, silent giant was harmed by the toxic fallout of her shattered life. When they finally arrived back at the heavy, hand-hewn log cabin, the deep blue shadows of night had completely swallowed the homestead. Callahan lifted her down from the sleigh with his usual, breathtaking care, his massive hands holding her tiny waist as if she were made of spun glass. He carried the heavy sacks of flour and the bundles of new winter clothing inside, immediately setting to work, stoking the roaring stone hearth to drive back the creeping frost. He moved with that same quiet, effortless grace, completely unaffected by the dramatic confrontation in the town below. But Evelina could not settle. The frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal coursed through her delicate veins. She waited until his broad back was turned, until he stepped outside into the howling dark to unhitch and settle the massive draft horses in the sturdy timber barn. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, she moved with a desperate, frantic speed. She rushed to the corner of the room, throwing open the lid of her battered, single trunk. She did not have much. A spare threadbare blouse, a pair of worn cotton stockings, a small, faded, tin-type photograph of her mother. She began to pack, her pale hands shaking so violently she dropped the items twice. Tears, hot and completely uncontrollable, began to spill over her dark eyelashes, carving silent, shimmering tracks down her flushed cheeks. It was entirely unfair. For 3 incredibly brief, beautiful days, she had tasted true safety. She had felt the intoxicating, completely foreign sensation of being valued, of being protected without condition. But the world did not allow fragile things to remain safe. She knew she could not survive the brutal winter night alone on foot, but she had to try. She would walk to the neighboring ridge, try to find a stagecoach station, offer to wash floors, clean stables, do absolutely anything to put distance between her dangerous past and this honorable man's peaceful sanctuary. She reached deep into the pocket of her morning dress, her trembling fingers brushing against the familiar, cracked edge of her tortoise-shell hair comb, the emotional anchor of her shattered life. She pulled it out, staring at the delicate broken tines in the flickering, golden light of the hearth. A ragged, completely agonizing sob tore from her throat. The memory of Callahan kneeling on the hard wooden floorboards, his massive, calloused hand gently holding this worthless piece of broken shell, hit her with the crushing force of a physical avalanche. She pressed the comb to her chest, her slender frame shaking violently as the profound, beautiful tragedy of her situation entirely overwhelmed her. She was deeply, utterly in love with a man who communicated in silence, a man whose shadow offered more warmth than 1,000 city fires. And because she loved him, she absolutely had to abandon him. The heavy iron latch of the front door clicked with a terrifying, sudden loudness. Evelina gasped, spinning around on her knees, her delicate hands clutching the threadbare blouse and the cracked comb tightly to her chest. Callahan stood in the doorway, the shrieking winter wind swirling snow around his heavy, scuffed boots. He had stripped off his massive coat, revealing the heavy suspenders and the thick wool flannel stretching over his immense chest. His steely blue eyes swept the room, instantly taking in the open trunk, the hastily piled clothing, and the desperate, tear-streaked terror completely consuming her pale face. He pushed the heavy oak door shut, cutting off the howling storm, instantly sealing them within the suffocating, heavy silence of the cabin. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He looked at Mothra with a depth of sorrow and an immovable, terrifying resolve that made the breath completely vanish from her lungs. He walked slowly across the rough-hewn floorboards, his heavy boots making no sound. He towered over her kneeling, fragile form, casting her entirely in his vast, protective shadow. Evelina instinctively shrank back, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. She braced herself for the questions, for the demands to explain her foolish, desperate plan. She opened her mouth to speak, to pour out her apologies, to tell him she was leaving to protect him. But before a single trembling syllable could leave her lips, Callahan knelt down. The floorboards groaned as he folded his massive frame, bringing his piercing blue eyes completely level with her tear-filled gaze. He reached out with hands that could easily bend iron bars and gently, agonizingly slowly, took the threadbare blouse from her trembling grip. He tossed it carelessly aside. Then, he looked down at the cracked tortoiseshell comb she was clutching against her frantically beating heart. He did not take the comb. Instead, he reached out and wrapped his massive, incredibly worn hands completely over her freezing, trembling fingers, encasing her hands and the broken comb entirely within his deeply calloused grip. The raw, grounding heat radiating from his skin instantly short-circuited her panic. He held her gaze, his steely eyes demanding her absolute, unbroken attention. He was forcing her to look at the reality of the situation, forcing her to see the immovable truth he had silently established. From the very first moment he lifted her trunk on that freezing train platform, he squeezed her hands gently, a physical transmission of absolute, uncompromising safety. He was telling her that her fears were completely irrelevant. He was telling her that the wealthy men in the East and the cruel gossips in the town were entirely powerless against the walls of his cabin. He was silently demanding that she stop running, that she finally realize she possessed a quiet, diamond-like resilience that made her deeply, profoundly worthy of the absolute sanctuary he was providing. Evelina stared into his eyes, the terrifying, agonizing tension slowly draining from her delicate muscles. The frantic urge to flee evaporated, replaced by a completely overwhelming, beautiful wave of absolute surrender. She realized, in that quiet, fiercely protected space, that true strength did not mean running away to protect him. True strength meant trusting him enough to stay. It meant setting a permanent boundary against the toxic ghosts of her past, and finally allowing herself to be cherished exactly as she was, broken pieces and all. She slowly uncurled her fingers, letting the cracked comb rest safely within the massive sanctuary of his hold. She let out a long, shuddering breath, a tear slipping free to trace a final, sparkling path down her cheek. Callahan's hardened features softened just a fraction. He reached up, his thick thumb gently wiping the moisture away, his touch as reverent as if he were handling a priceless, sacred artifact. The silence in the cabin was no longer suffocating. It was profoundly intimate, humming with a deep, unspoken bond of mutual healing. He stood up, retrieving the heavy trunk with one effortless motion and sliding it firmly back against the wall, utterly closing the door on her desperate attempt to flee. He turned back, gesturing silently toward the warm hearth and the comfortable chair. For the first time in an entire year, Evelina did not perch nervously on the edge of the seat. She sat back, letting the golden warmth of the fire wash over her. A fragile woman, finally rooting herself in the immovable earth of his protection. But just as the profound, beautiful peace finally settled entirely over her exhausted soul, a sound violently shattered the quiet isolation of the mountain. It was not the howling wind, and it was not the settling of the heavy timber logs. It was a loud, deliberate, heavy knock, striking the thick oak of the front door. Now Mort wants you to really think about the sheer, terrifying impossibility of that sound. Out there on the remote, unforgiving edge of the Montana Territory, separated from the gossiping town by miles of treacherous, snow-choked trails, a knock on the door in the dead of a howling winter night is not a casual visit. It is an invasion. The heavy, deliberate thud against the thick oak planks echoed through the hushed intimacy of the log cabin, like the blast of a cannon, violently shattering the profoundly beautiful peace that had just settled over Evelina's exhausted soul. The sound was so incredibly abrasive, so utterly alien to the isolated sanctuary Callahan had built that for a single suspended second, the entire world seemed to stop breathing. The crackling of the massive stone hearth faded into absolute insignificance. The shrieking demonic wind, battering the timber walls, became nothing more than a faint whisper compared to the deafening, frantic hammering of Evelina's own heart. She was still kneeling on the rough-hewn floorboards, the cracked, tortuous shell comb resting safely within the towering mountain man's deeply calloused grip, but the golden warmth of the fire instantly vanished from her skin. The blood in her delicate veins flash froze. She knew, with a horrifying, sickening certainty that twisted her stomach into agonizing knots, exactly what that sound represented. It was the East. It was the cruel, relentless reach of her wealthy brother-in-law, tearing through the pristine frontier wilderness to drag her back into a life of unimaginable, suffocating torment. Evelina's hazel eyes, previously wide with a vulnerable, trembling surrender, instantly glazed over with raw, unadulterated terror. The fragile diamond-like resilience she had begun to embrace shattered back into a million jagged pieces of panicked prey instinct. She tried to rip her pale, freezing hands away from Callahan's massive grasp, the desperate urge to scramble backward, to throw herself into the dark, suffocating depth of her battered trunk, completely overwhelming her rational thought. She was a broken, destitute widow, a woman whose entire existence had been systematically pulverized by men who wielded money and societal influence like heavy iron clubs. The men outside that door would have warrants. They would have official, deeply embossed legal papers declaring her completely insane, a dangerous liability, a criminal who had stolen family wealth. They would use words that sounded proper and civilized to justify dragging a weeping, terrified woman out into the freezing snow by her hair. She gasped, a ragged, agonizing sound tearing from her throat, her slender frame shaking so violently she practically vibrated against the floorboards. She looked up at Callahan, her tear-streaked face a completely shattered mask of pleading apology, fully expecting the towering giant to finally realize the massive, catastrophic trouble she had brought to his peaceful doorstep. But Callahan did not release her trembling hands. The massive, immovable rancher did not flinch, he did not jump, and he certainly did not display a single ounce of fear. The terrifying transformation that overtook his immense, muscular frame was entirely silent and incredibly slow. His broad, heavy shoulders, previously relaxed in the intimate quiet of the moment, slowly bunched and coiled, the thick wool of his flannel shirt stretching taut over slabs of hardened muscle. His deeply tanned, weathered jaw clenched with such sudden brutal force that the muscles visibly jumped beneath his dark beard. He turned his head toward the heavy oak door, his piercing, steely blue eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculated, predatory focus. He was not a man who feared the law, because out here, in the brutal, unforgiving shadow of the mountains, paper and city titles held absolutely zero weight. Out here, survival was dictated by the elements, and by the men strong enough to master them. Callahan was the master of this domain, and something incredibly hostile had just dared to intrude upon the only fragile thing he had ever chosen to fiercely protect. With an excruciating, deliberate gentleness that completely contradicted the violent, seething aura radiating from his towering frame, Callahan slowly released Evelina's trembling fingers. He gave her pale hands one final, anchoring squeeze, a silent, immovable command to stay exactly where she was, to remain within the golden, protective light of his hearth. He rose to his full, terrifying height. The floorboards groaned in heavy, rhythmic protest as he took slow, completely unhurried steps toward the front of the cabin. He did not grab his heavy iron hunting rifle resting above the mantel. He did not pull the long, wicked hunting knife strapped to his thick, leather belt. A man of his colossal size, a man whose very silhouette completely eclipsed the doorway, did not require weapons to obliterate a threat. His mere physical presence, the raw, unfiltered masculine dominance he projected with every single breath, was a far more devastating force than any bullet. The heavy, abrasive knock sounded again, louder, more frantic this time, accompanied by a muffled, demanding shout completely swallowed by the howling blizzard. Callahan reached the door. He did not pause to ask who was there. He simply wrapped his massive, heavily scarred hand around the iron latch and threw the heavy oak door wide open. The screaming winter storm violently invaded the cabin, sending a blinding swirl of crystalline snow and freezing wind rushing across the floorboards. The fire in the hearth roared in sudden, chaotic protest, casting wildly dancing, monstrous shadows against the log walls. Standing on the snow-swept porch, violently shivering in a ridiculously expensive, completely inadequate city overcoat, was a man who reeked of cheap cologne, stale tobacco, and arrogant, unearned authority. He was a hired city detective, a Pinkerton agent dispatched directly from the wealthy estates of Boston, his pinched, sneering face flushed and ugly mottled purple from the biting frost. He held a thick leather satchel clutched tightly against his narrow chest, his eyes squinting against the blinding snow, and the sudden, overwhelming heat radiating from the cabin interior. The detective stepped forward, his mouth opening to deliver whatever rehearsed, deeply intimidating legal threat he had been paid handsomely to execute. But the words instantly choked and died in his throat. He had expected to find a lonely, desperate woman hiding in a dilapidated shack. He had expected to kick the door in and easily terrify a fragile widow into absolute submission. Instead, he found himself staring directly into the immense, unyielding chest of a man who looked like he could uproot a fully grown pine tree with his bare hands. Callahan stood perfectly still in the open doorway, completely ignoring the freezing wind whipping at his thick flannel shirt. His broad, incredibly massive shoulders touched Bayotay hot sides of the heavy timber frame, entirely blocking the detective's view of the cabin interior. The towering mountain man did not speak a single syllable. He did not ask the man's business. He simply stared down at the trembling, freezing city agent with a look of such absolute bone-chilling apathy that it was profoundly terrifying. It was the look of a mountain contemplating a deeply annoying, entirely insignificant insect. The detective physically swallowed, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling under the crushing, silent weight of Callahan's steely blue gaze. He took a tiny involuntary step backward, his expensive leather boots slipping on the icy porch boards. But the man was being paid a staggering sum of money by Evelina's cruel brother-in-law, and greed momentarily overpowered his survival instinct. He fumbled frantically with his frozen, gloved fingers, ripping open the leather satchel and pulling out a thick sheaf of crisp, heavily stamped legal documents. He shoved the papers forward, his voice completely devoid of its former booming confidence, pitching into a reedy, nasal whine that barely carried over the howling wind. He began to loudly declare his authority, spewing a rapid, venomous stream of city laws, custody decrees, and vicious accusations. He claimed he was there to repossess stolen estate property. He claimed the woman hiding inside was deeply, clinically unstable, a danger to herself, and legally bound to return to the sanitarium. Her family had so graciously arranged for her. Inside the cabin, Evelina remained frozen on the floorboards, every single cruel, sneering word slicing through her newly healing heart like a jagged, rusty blade. The detective's voice was the voice of her tormentors. It was the sound of the society that had completely abandoned her, the sound of the wealthy men who had locked her in dark rooms and told her she was entirely worthless. The suffocating weight of her past trauma crashed over her ite. At such violent force she physically doubled over, wrapping her delicate arms around her knees, desperately trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She squeezed her haunted hazel eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable moment when the towering giant blocking the door would step aside. She waited for Callahan to look at the impressive, stamped papers, to realize the massive legal trouble he was inviting into his home, and to simply hand her over to avoid the catastrophic fallout. She was a liability. She had always been a liability. The detective, sensing no physical resistance, grew incredibly emboldened by Callahan's silence. He tried to physically push past the massive mountain man, attempting to wedge his narrow shoulders through the doorway to spot his terrified prey. It was a completely fatal miscalculation. Callahan did not strike the man. He did not raise a hand in anger. He simply shifted his immense weight forward by a single terrifying inch. The movement was so subtle, yet so impossibly powerful, that the detective slammed directly into Callahan's rock-solid chest, bouncing off the towering rancher, as if he had just walked face first into a brick wall. The city agent stumbled wildly backward, dropping the crisp legal documents into the swirling snow, his eyes going wide. They kept ite hot, pure, unadulterated panic as he finally recognized the deadly, explosive violence simmering just beneath Callahan's stoic, silent surface. "You are harboring a fugitive," the detective practically shrieked, pointing a trembling, frozen finger up at the towering giant. "You have no legal right. Those papers demand her immediate return. Moat will return with the town sheriff. Moat will return with a federal marshal. Moat will see you ruined, you ignorant savage." Callahan remained entirely unbothered by the hysterical, screeching threats. He slowly lowered his head, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the terrified, shivering man with a crushing, absolute dominance that made the freezing winter air feel incredibly heavy. He slowly reached out with his massive calloused hand, pointing a single, thick finger, not at the dropped legal papers, but out into the pitch-black, howling abyss of the freezing Montana night. It was a silent, uncompromising ultimatum. The message was unequivocally, beautifully clear. There was no law out here but his. There was no authority greater than the walls of his cabin. The city detective could either te uro no around and attempt to survive the freezing, deadly trek back down the mountain, or he could take one more step toward the door and become a permanent, unmarked fixture in the snowdrifts. The choice was his, and Callahan was entirely indifferent to the outcome. But Evelina, still cowering near the hearth, suddenly experienced a profound, earth-shattering shift within her shattered soul. She looked at the towering, immovable silhouette of the man standing in the doorway, taking the full, brutal brunt of the freezing storm and the venomous threats of her past, completely unyielding, entirely focused on protecting a fragile woman he barely knew. He was fighting for her. He was risking his peaceful isolation, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom, to stand as a permanent physical shield between her and the monsters of her past. She remembered the excruciating gentleness of his massive hands holding her cracked, tortoise-shell comb. She remembered the way he had burned the vicious letter without a single glance. He had silently, fiercely demanded that she recognize her own worth. If this magnificent, honorable giant was willing to defy the entire world to keep her safe, how could she possibly continue to cower in the shadows? A quiet, diamond-like resilience, a strength she had buried deep beneath years of psychological torment and cruel abandonment, suddenly roared to life inside her delicate chest. She would not let this arrogant, sneering city agent disrespect the man who had saved her life. She would not let the toxic ghosts of her past dictate her future for one more terrifying second. Evelina uncurled her trembling limbs. She pushed herself up from the rough-hewn floorboards, her bare feet completely ignoring the chilling drafts sweeping across the cabin. She smoothed the front of her threadbare morning dress, lifted her delicate chin, and walked directly toward the open, howling doorway. The detective was still desperately babbling, trying to gather his scattered legal papers from the snowy porch, his teeth chattering uncontrollably in the bitter wind. He looked up, his sneering face twisting into a cruel, triumphant smirk as Evelina's slender figure finally emerged from the shadows of the cabin. But his malicious gloating instantly died in his throat. This was not the terrified, broken, hysterically weeping woman he had been sent to retrieve. Evelina did not shrink away. She did not cast her haunted hazel eyes to the floorboards. She stepped directly behind Callahan, reaching out with her small, incredibly delicate hands, and firmly grasped the thick wool of his heavy flannel shirt. She anchored herself completely to the massive, immovable mountain of a man, standing perfectly upright, her striking, ethereal beauty illuminated by the wildly dancing firelight from within. She looked directly into the terrified, freezing eyes of the city agent, her gaze carrying a newfound, breathtaking absolute defiance. She did not need to speak. Her physical stance, her complete, unwavering trust in the towering protector standing before her, communicated a truth more powerful than any legal document. She was not a piece of property to be claimed. She was exactly where she belonged, and she was entirely untouchable. Callahan felt the small, trembling grip of her delicate hands anchoring against his broad back. A sudden, powerful jolt of pure, terrifyingly protective electricity shot straight through his massive frame. The fact that she had chosen to stand, to actively claim her space within his absolute protection, instead of hiding, fundamentally shifted the dynamic of the entire confrontation. He did not look back at her, but the muscles in his immense shoulders relaxed just a fraction, a silent, profound acknowledgement of her incredible, newfound courage. He turned his attention back to the shivering, pathetic man on the porch. Callahan slowly reached down, his massive, heavily scarred fingers effortlessly scooping up the bundle of crisp, snowy legal documents. He held them for a long, heavy moment, the thick paper looking utterly insignificant in his giant grasp. Then, with a casual, devastatingly dismissive flick of his thick wrist, he tossed the entire stack of expensive city threats straight out into the shrieking blizzard. The howling wind instantly caught the papers, scattering the cruel lies and venomous demands into the dark, freezing abyss, completely erasing them from existence. The detective let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, lunging forward slightly, as if to chase the flying documents, but the sheer, intimidating presence of the towering rancher forced him to freeze in his tracks. Callahan reached out, grabbed the heavy iron latch of the oak door, and with a single, deafening, utterly final slam, shut the heavy timber door directly in the freezing agent's face. He violently threw the heavy iron deadbolt, the loud, mechanical clack sealing the cabin, instantly severing the terrifying connection to the outside world. The shrieking, demonic howl of the blizzard was instantly muffled, the chaotic dancing shadows settling back into the rich, golden, profoundly peaceful warmth of the roaring hearth. Evelina stood frozen directly behind him, her small hand still gripping the thick wool of his shirt. They kept ite hot, a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. Her heart was hammering a frantic, exhausting rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline of the confrontation was rapidly draining from her delicate system, leaving her completely physically depleted, her slender legs shaking violently. She had stood her ground. She had faced the horrifying embodiment of her past, and she had not shattered. But the absolute magnitude of what had just transpired, the stark, undeniable reality that Callahan had completely committed himself to a dangerous, high-stakes war entirely for her sake, hit her with the crushing force of a physical tidal wave. She let out a long, ragged, completely exhausted breath, her delicate forehead slowly dropping forward to rest against the center of his incredibly broad, muscular back. Callahan remained perfectly still for a long, heavy moment, allowing her fragile, exhausted frame to lean entirely against his immovable strength. He did not turn around immediately, instinctively understanding that the sudden transition from absolute terror to sudden safety required a delicate, quiet processing. He slowly reached up, his massive, deeply calloused hands covering her small, trembling fingers where they clutched his shirt. He gently, agonizingly, slowly peeled her tight grip away, not to push her away, but to turn his massive frame so he could face her completely. He looked down at her pale, exhausted face, his steely blue eyes completely devoid of the deadly, predatory fury he had directed at the detective. His gaze held nothing but an incredibly deep, entirely anchoring tenderness. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not demand gratitude. He simply stepped back, moving toward the heavy wooden table where he had placed the supplies from town earlier that day. Evelina watched him through heavy, tear-blurred eyes, her exhausted mind struggling to track his movements. He reached into one of the large burlap sacks and pulled out the thick, incredibly heavy bundle of high-quality blue woolen fabric he had purchased at the mercantile. He carried the massive bundle of rich, soft material over to the warm hearth, completely shaking out the folds. The fabric was stunning, a deep, vibrant indigo that completely rivaled the twilight sky. He stepped toward her, and with that same terrifying, breathtaking gentleness that constantly redefined his immense size, he draped the heavy, warm wool completely over her shivering, delicate shoulders. The weight of the fabric was instantly grounding, carrying the clean, dusty scent of the mercantile and the absolute, unspoken promise of a permanent future. He was not just shielding her from the draft. He was silently telling her that she was staying. He was investing in her warmth, in her survival, in her life within these log walls. Evelina clutched the edges of the beautiful blue wool, a fresh, hot tear slipping down her pale cheek, entirely overwhelmed by the profound, unbelievable depth of his completely silent, protective love. She wanted to speak, to somehow find the words to express the monumental shift that had just occurred within her shattered heart. But as she adjusted the heavy folds of the fabric around her delicate frame, her small fingers brushed against something hard and metallic caught deep within the layers of the wool. She paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. She reached into the folds, her fingertips grasping a cold, heavy object. She slowly pulled it out, bringing it into the flickering golden light of the fire. It was not a forgotten spool of thread from the mercantile. It was a heavy, deeply tarnished silver pocket watch, the metal heavily dented and completely scorched black on one side, as if it had been pulled directly from a massive fire. Evelina gasped, her hazel eyes flying up to meet Callahan's gaze. The towering, immovable mountain man had completely frozen in his tracks. The profound, anchoring calm in his steely blue eyes had entirely vanished, instantly replaced by a flash of such raw, agonizing, completely unguarded devastation that it made the breath completely vanish from Evelina's lungs. He had protected her secret without question. But as she stared at the scorched silver watch in her trembling hands, she realized with a terrifying, entirely earth-shattering clarity that this incredibly dangerous, massive man was hiding a devastating, tragic ghost of his own. Have you ever looked at a massive, towering mountain, a structure of pure, immovable stone that has withstood centuries of brutal storms, and suddenly realized there was a deep, jagged fault line running right through its center? That is the exact, breathtaking shock that hit Evelina as she stood in the center of that warm, fire-lit cabin. The heavy, stunningly beautiful blue wool slipped from her delicate shoulders, completely forgotten, pooling around her bare feet on the rough-hewn floorboards. In her small, trembling hands, she held the heavily dented, completely scorched silver pocket watch. The metal was cold, entirely lifeless, the intricate engravings on its surface melted and scarred by a heat so intense it defied imagination. But it was not the ruined object itself that made the breath completely vanish from her lungs. It was the towering giant standing before her. Callahan, the massive, deeply intimidating mountain man who had just single-handedly terrified a venomous city agent into absolute submission, looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. His incredibly broad shoulders, previously bunched with raw, protective fury, suddenly slumped. The fierce, steely blue fire in his eyes completely extinguished, replaced by a vast, hollow expanse of such profound, unguarded devastation that it physically hurt to witness. He was no longer the imposing master of the frontier. He was a man completely paralyzed by a ghost. Evelina physically recoiled, entirely overwhelmed by the sudden, terrifying shift in the cabin's atmosphere. She had spent the last several days marveling at his absolute strength, leaning entirely on his immovable silence to shield her from her own horrific trauma. She had selfishly believed he was invincible, a perfectly stoic savior who required absolutely nothing from the world. But as she watched his deeply tanned, weathered face drain of all color, as she saw his massive, heavily scarred hands begin to tremble violently at his sides, she realized the staggering, tragic truth. He was not isolating himself on this freezing, remote ridge because he hated the world. He was hiding. The man who had effortlessly absorbed the full, agonizing weight of her past was carrying an anchor of grief so massive it was slowly pulling him under the ice. Callahan did not speak. He did not let out a ragged sigh or a frustrated groan. The silence that fell over him was not his usual anchoring calm. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a tomb. He moved with a sudden, jerky stiffness that completely contradicted his usual effortless grace. He reached out, his massive, trembling fingers delicately plucking the scorched silver watch from Evelina's pale hands. He did not look at her. He could not meet her wide, terrified hazel eyes. He turned his broad back to her, retreating into the deepest, darkest corner of the cabin, far away from the golden, cheerful light of the roaring hearth. He sank heavily onto a sturdy wooden crate, his towering frame folding entirely in on itself. He rested his massive elbows on his knees, bowing his dark, bearded head, completely hiding his face in his massive hands. The ruined pocket watch was clutched so tightly in his fist that his knuckles strained bone white against his tanned skin. He looked impossibly small, a broken giant completely consumed by a memory he could not fight and a pain he could not simply physically overpower. For a long, terrifying moment, Evelina remained completely frozen by the hearth. The old, deeply ingrained instincts of her past screamed at her to retreat, to make herself entirely invisible, to never intrude upon the anger or the grief of a dangerous man. In the grand, wealthy estates of her former life, witnessing a man's vulnerability was a punishable offense, an invitation for cruel backlash. Her slender legs trembled, the urge to crawl into her heavy bed and hide beneath the furs almost completely overwhelming her fragile senses. But then, she looked down at the pile of rich, heavy blue wool resting by her freezing feet. She remembered the excruciating, breathtaking gentleness he had shown her when she had dropped her cracked tortoise shell comb. She remembered the aggressive black ink of her brother-in-law, San's venomous letter curling into meaningless ash within the flames. Entirely because this towering man had chosen to blindly, fiercely trust her. He had systematically dismantled her terror, brick by agonizing brick, without ever demanding a single thing in return. A quiet, diamond-like resilience. The very same strength Callahan had silently demanded she recognize within herself just moments before, began to pulse fiercely through her delicate veins. She would not abandon him to the dark. She would not let the man who had dragged her back from the edge of the abyss drown entirely in his own silent despair. She deliberately turned away from the heavy furs of the bed. She walked toward the small, cast-iron stove in the kitchen area, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the floorboards. She moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, forcing her trembling hands to remain steady. She filled the heavy tin kettle with fresh water from the wooden bucket, stoking the dying embers in the stove until a small, steady flame licked the iron. She found the small jar of roasted coffee beans he had purchased at the mercantile, carefully grinding them in the heavy iron mill, the rhythmic, grating sound cutting through the suffocating silence of the cabin. The scent of rich, strong coffee slowly began to fill the heavy air, mixing with the sharp tang of wood smoke and the lingering scent of the freezing blizzard raging outside. Evelina poured the steaming, dark liquid into a heavy tin mug. She wrapped her pale, delicate fingers completely around the hot metal, letting the intense heat ground her frantic nerves. She turned, facing the dark shadowed corner, where the massive mountain man remained entirely frozen in his agonizing grief. She took a deep, trembling breath, forcing her slender shoulders back, and slowly walked across the room. She did not hesitate. She did not apologize for her presence. She simply knelt directly on the rough, splintered floorboards beside him, entirely ignoring the biting draft, seeping through the log joints. Callahan did not move. He remained completely hunched over, his massive face buried in his hands, completely lost to whatever horrific memory the scorched silver watch had resurrected. Evelina did not try to force him to look at her. She did not bombard him with useless, hollow questions. She understood better than anyone on earth that some wounds were too raw, too agonizingly deep to be touched by mere words. She simply set the steaming tin mug onto the floorboards near his heavy, scuffed boots. Then, very slowly, with an excruciating, breathtaking tenderness, she reached out and rested her small, delicate hand directly against the thick, muscular expanse of his broad shoulder. The physical contrast was absolutely staggering. Her hand looked impossibly tiny, incredibly fragile against the immense, hardened muscle beneath his thick wool flannel shirt. But the moment her pale fingers made contact, a violent shudder ripped completely through Callahan's massive frame. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath that sounded entirely like a suppressed sob. He slowly lowered his hands, lifting his deeply tanned, weathered face from the shadows. His steely blue eyes were completely red-rimmed, swimming with an ocean of unshed tears he had stubbornly held back for years. He looked down at her delicate hand resting on his shoulder, then slowly turned his gaze to meet her intensely focused, profoundly compassionate hazel eyes. He was bracing himself for pity. He was waiting for the revulsion, the inevitable shrinking away that always occurred when people realized the terrifying, broken truth. Beneath his stoic, dangerous exterior. But Evelina did not shrink away. She pressed her delicate fingers more firmly against his heavy shoulder. A silent, immovable anchor in the middle of his raging emotional storm. She offered him the exact same profound, unquestioning acceptance he had unconditionally given her. The silence stretched for a long, heavy eternity, the only sound the violent howling of the wind battering the timber walls. Then, the mountain finally broke. Callahan's voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, gravelly rasp, heavily rusted from years of absolute disuse and choked with an agonizing, suffocating sorrow. He did not look at her as he spoke. He stared blankly at the scorched silver watch clutched in his massive palm, the words tearing from his throat like jagged shards of glass. He spoke of a time before the absolute isolation of the mountain. He spoke of a sprawling, deeply prosperous lumber mill in the lush green valleys of the Oregon Territory, a massive legacy entirely built by the sweat and blood of his family. He described his older brother, a man possessing a brilliant mechanical mind, a man who had gifted him the intricately engraved silver watch as a testament to their unbreakable bond. Callahan's massive chest heaved, his breathing turning incredibly shallow and frantic. As he forced himself to recount the horrific night, the sky turned entirely orange. A catastrophic malfunction in the boiler room. A sudden, massive explosion that tore through the heavy timber framing like wet paper. He described the absolute, suffocating terror of waking to a world completely consumed by a roaring, unnatural inferno. Evelina listened in absolute, unbroken silence, her heart physically aching for the towering giant. The extreme state verbs he used, the raw, unfiltered agony, completely stripping away his stoic mask, painted a horrifyingly vivid picture. He described tearing through the burning, collapsing mill, his immense physical strength, easily snapping, burning beams and crushing heavy doors. But when he finally reached the lowest level, he found his brother entirely trapped beneath a massive, immovable section of the collapsed iron boiler. Callahan choked on a ragged, devastating sob. The massive, terrifyingly strong rancher, reduced to a completely shattered shell. He detailed the agonizing, futile struggle, the way he had braced his immense shoulders against the burning iron, pushing with every single ounce of his colossal strength, pushing until his muscles literally tore, and his skin blistered under the intense heat. But the iron had not moved. His terrifying, legendary physical power, the very strength that defined his existence, had been completely, utterly useless when it mattered the most. He had been forced to watch, completely powerless, as the flames consumed the only family he had left. The only thing he had managed to pull from the ashes the next morning was the scorched, ruined silver pocket watch. He had left the Oregon Territory that exact same day, walking away from the ashes of his legacy, punishing himself with the brutal, freezing isolation of the remote Montana ridge. He believed, with a completely toxic, deeply ingrained certainty, that his massive size and dangerous strength were entirely cursed. He believed he was entirely unworthy of human connection, fundamentally broken, because he had failed to be the protector he was physically designed to be. Evelina felt hot, uncontrollable tears spilling over her dark eyelashes, carving shimmering paths down her pale cheeks. The absolute, staggering tragedy of his confession completely shattered her heart. He was a man who spent every single day fiercely protecting the fragile things of the world, entirely because he was violently haunted by the one fragile life he could not save. He looked at her, his steely blue eyes completely utterly devastated, fully expecting her to finally see the horrifying failure he truly was. He fully expected her to rise from the floorboards, gather her threadbare belongings, and flee from the cursed, broken giant. Instead, Evelina moved closer. She shifted entirely off her knees, sitting completely on the rough floorboards, completely ignoring the freezing draft. She reached deep into the pocket of her faded morning dress. Her trembling fingers brushed against the familiar, cracked edge of her tortoise-shell hair comb. She pulled the fragile, broken object out, holding it up into the dim flickering light, reaching their shadowed corner. She slowly reached out and placed the cracked, seemingly worthless piece of shell directly next to the heavily scorched, ruined silver watch in his massive calloused palm. Callahan froze, his tear-filled eyes dropping to the two broken objects resting side by side. Evelina did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell him the fire was not his fault, because logic holds absolutely no weight against the suffocating chains of profound trauma. She simply placed her two small, incredibly delicate hands completely over his massive, trembling one, enveloping both the cracked comb and the scorched watch in a warm, fiercely protective grip. She looked directly into his devastated eyes, her hazel gaze completely devoid of fear, radiating a fierce, immovable resilience. She was silently communicating a truth more powerful than any legal document or spoken apology. She was telling him that a cracked comb could still hold beauty, and a scorched watch could still hold profound meaning. She was entirely rejecting his belief that broken things were useless. He had taken her completely shattered, terrified soul and treated it with the utmost, breathtaking reverence. Now she was doing the exact same thing for him. The realization hit Callahan with the crushing, magnificent force of a sunrise breaking over a frozen glacier. The deep, jagged fault line running through the center of his massive, stoic heart did not magically close, but the agonizing pressure suddenly vanished. He let out a long, violently shuddering breath, the immense, suffocating weight of 1,000 days of isolated guilt slowly draining from his incredibly broad shoulders. He did not pull his massive hand away. Instead, he carefully, deliberately turned his palm, entirely lacing his thick, heavily scarred fingers completely through her delicate ones. He held on to her, as if she were the only solid, immovable thing in a world composed entirely of falling ash. The massive, towering protector and the fragile, terrified widow sat quietly in the dark, freezing corner of the cabin, their completely broken pieces fitting perfectly together, forging a deeply profound, entirely unbreakable bond of mutual salvation. The night slowly bled away, taking the demonic, shrieking fury of the winter blizzard with it. Morning broke over the remote Montana ridge, with an aggressive, blindingly bright stillness. The sky was a startling, crystalline blue, the massive snowdrifts glittering like millions of scattered diamonds under the harsh winter sun. Inside the cabin, the heavy, suffocating tension of the previous days had completely evaporated. There was a quiet, profoundly beautiful harmony to their movements. Evelina moved around the small kitchen area, her slender frame draped in the warm, heavy blue wool, effortlessly preparing breakfast, while Callahan methodically cleaned and oiled his heavy iron tools near the hearth. They did not speak of the horrific confrontation with the city detective, nor did they discuss the agonizing tears shed in the dark corner. The shared trauma had bonded them on a cellular level, replacing terror with a quiet, fierce devotion. When Callahan finally stepped out onto the front porch to check the massive draft horses in the timber barn, the freezing winter air felt entirely different. It was no longer a punishing, isolating barrier. It was a crisp, protective moat surrounding their shared sanctuary. Evelina stood in the doorway, watching the sheer raw power of his massive frame easily cutting through the deep snowdrifts. A completely terrifying, fiercely beautiful realization bloomed in her delicate chest. She was deeply, unequivocally in love with this silent giant, and she was entirely willing to fight the rest of the world to remain by his side. But the world, especially the cruel, wealthy men who viewed humans as property, rarely surrendered easily. Just as Callahan turned back toward the cabin, a heavy load of fresh firewood balanced effortlessly on his massive shoulder. The sharp, aggressive crunch of multiple horses, cutting through the deep crust of the snow, echoed across the ridge. Evelina froze in the doorway, the blood instantly turning to ice in her delicate veins. The brief, beautiful illusion of absolute safety violently shattered. Emerging from the treacherous, snow-choked trail, leading up from the town, were 4 heavily bundled riders. Callahan instantly dropped the massive load of firewood. The heavy timber logs crashed into the snow with a deafening thud. He moved with a terrifying, explosive speed, his massive boots eating up the distance to the porch in seconds. He practically threw himself in front of Evelina, his incredibly broad shoulders completely blocking her delicate frame from view, acting as an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and heavy wool. His hand instinctively hovered near his thick leather belt, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the approaching riders with a deadly, calculated fury. But as the horses drew closer, the agonizing panic gripping Evelina's throat shifted into a state of absolute, Profound confusion. These were not hired city thugs. They were not Pinkerton agents draped in expensive coats. Leading the group was a man wearing the heavy canvas duster and the unmistakable tarnished silver star of the territorial law. It was the town sheriff, a hard-bitten, deeply serious man who rarely bothered with the isolated homesteaders unless entirely forced to by official territorial mandates. The sheriff brought his heavily lathered horse to a halt 10 yards from the porch, deliberately keeping a respectful, cautious distance from the towering, seething mountain man. The 3 deputies spread out behind him, their hands resting nervously near their iron holsters, completely intimidated by the sheer, colossal magnitude of Callahan's unyielding stance. The sheriff did not sneer, and he did not shout. He reached inside his heavy duster, pulling out a thick, official document bearing the heavy red wax seal of a federal circuit judge. Evelina clutched the thick wool of Callahan's shirt, her slender frame trembling violently. The city detective had made good on his threat. He had gone straight to the territorial authorities, leveraging the massive wealth of her brother-in-law to secure a federal warrant for her immediate arrest. The crushing weight of the law was finally here to violently drag her back to the east. But as the sheriff unfolded the heavy, official parchment, his hard eyes did not scan the porch, looking for a fragile, terrified widow. His gaze remained entirely, rigidly fixed on the massive towering rancher standing in his path. The sheriff cleared his throat, the sound incredibly loud in the freezing stillness, and delivered a statement that made the entire world completely stop spinning. "Moat have a federal decree here, Mr. Callahan," the sheriff called out, his voice completely devoid of malice, laced instead with a deep, unsettling grimness. "But it ain't an arrest warrant for the lady. The city agent made a massive mistake when he telegraphed your name back to his bosses in the east. They ain't just looking for a runaway widow anymore. The men funding this hunt just realized exactly who you are, and they have officially purchased the outstanding debt on that ruined Oregon lumber mill you left behind. Now, you have to truly understand how men who possess dirty, limitless money actually operate in this world. They do not fight with their fists, and they certainly never step out into the freezing, brutal elements to face their enemies eye to eye. They fight with paper, with deeply embossed territorial decrees, and with the suffocating, inescapable chains of financial ruin. When that town sheriff sat on his heavily lathered horse, his breath pluming in the aggressive winter air, and delivered that catastrophic revelation, the entire mountain seemed to hold its breath. The venomous brother-in-law back in Boston, a man named Arthur, had not just tracked his escaped victim to the edge of the wilderness. He had utilized his massive network of corrupt city lawyers and private investigators to uncover the terrifying, towering giant protecting her. He had dug through the ashes of the Oregon Territory, found the catastrophic, outstanding debt from the ruined lumber mill, and officially purchased it. Arthur now completely owned the massive financial burden that Callahan had fled from, turning a tragic, agonizing accident into a weapon of absolute, legal destruction. The sheriff unrolled the heavy parchment, his deeply lined face grim, fully aware that he was holding a lit stick of dynamite in front of a completely unpredictable inferno. He read the total amount owed, a staggering, astronomical sum of money that could practically buy half the Montana Territory. The words echoed off the frost-covered pines, hanging in the freezing air like a death sentence. The decree was absolute. The federal court recognized Arthur as the sole creditor, granting him immediate, unyielding power to collect. The sheriff slowly lowered the paper, his hard eyes locking onto Callahan's completely stoic, unreadable face, delivering the cruel, sickening ultimatum Arthur had meticulously engineered. If Callahan surrendered the fragile widow immediately into the custody of the territorial law, the entire debt would be officially forgiven, completely wiped clean by a judge's pen. He would keep his isolated sanctuary, his freedom, and his completely secluded life. If he refused, the federal marshals would ride up the mountain by sundown tomorrow. They would seize the massive draft horses. They would confiscate the land. They would auction the timber cabin, and they would arrest the towering mountain man for massive, intentional federal fraud, dragging him away in heavy iron chains. Evelina stood entirely frozen on the porch, her slender, delicate frame completely enveloped in the massive, heavy blue wool Callahan had given her the night before. The suffocating, terrifying weight of the sheriff's words hit her with the physical, bone-crushing force of a runaway locomotive. The blood instantly drained completely from her beautiful, striking face, leaving her as pale as the snowdrifts banking against the timber walls. The horrifying, inescapable reality of her toxic past had finally managed to corner her. Arthur had always viewed human beings as mere chess pieces, easily manipulated and completely disposable. He had constructed a flawlessly cruel trap, utilizing the absolute worst, most agonizing failure of Callahan's past to force the giant into submission. A violent, frantic wave of pure, unadulterated guilt slammed into Evelina's delicate chest, tearing the breath completely from her lungs. She looked up at the towering, immovable silhouette of the man standing firmly between her and the territorial law. He had given her absolutely everything. He had provided a fiercely protected sanctuary. He had completely validated her broken, shattered soul, and he had treated her terrifying trauma with an excruciating, breathtaking reverence. Now entirely because she existed, entirely because she had brought the toxic infection of her past to his pristine doorstep, he was about to lose absolutely everything he owned. He was going to lose his freedom. The old, deeply ingrained instincts of the completely subjugated city widow screamed frantically in her mind. The instinct to sacrifice herself, to throw her fragile body entirely onto the altar of his survival, surged violently through her trembling limbs. It was the only logical, honorable choice. She had to step forward. She had to surrender her wrists to the sheriff's iron shackles. She had to beg them to leave the magnificent, innocent giant alone. She took a short, jagged, completely agonizing breath, her delicate fingers slowly loosening their desperate grip on the thick wool of Callahan's heavy flannel shirt. She braced her fragile shoulders, preparing to step out from behind his massive, protective shadow, preparing to speak the words that would completely destroy her own life in order to save his. But before the delicate, leather sole of her boot could even move a single inch across the icy porch boards, Callahan reacted. The massive, towering mountain man did not turn his head. He did not look back to ask her permission, and he certainly did not require her input. He simply reached his massive, incredibly powerful arm backward, his heavily calloused hand clamping entirely around her slender, trembling forearm. His grip was completely devoid of violence, yet it possessed a terrifying, absolute immovability. It was an iron anchor violently halting a ship from drifting into a catastrophic hurricane. He squeezed her fragile arm with an excruciating, deliberate firmness, a completely silent, roaring command that vibrated straight through her delicate bones. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not dare surrender. Callahan slowly released her arm, stepping completely off the edge of the wooden porch. The heavy floorboards groaned in profound relief as his colossal weight shifted onto the deep, crusted snow. He did not bother to put on his heavy canvas coat. He walked directly toward the sheriff, his massive boots punching deep, violent holes into the frozen earth. The three deputies sitting behind the sheriff immediately stiffened, their horses dancing nervously backward, completely terrified by the sheer, explosive dominance radiating from the approaching giant. Callahan did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his deep, gravelly voice in anger. He stopped exactly 2 feet from the sheriff's lathered horse, his incredibly broad, muscular shoulders entirely blocking the lawman's view of the cabin, and the fragile woman shivering on the porch. He slowly reached up, his thick, scarred fingers grasping the edge of the heavy official federal parchment still clutched in the sheriff's gloved hand. He effortlessly tore the document away. He did not read the astronomical numbers. He did not glance at the deeply embossed red wax seal representing the terrifying, absolute power of the Eastern elite. He slowly, methodically folded the thick parchment in half, then in half again, completely reducing the massive, life-altering threat into a tiny, insignificant square of paper. He reached up and deliberately tucked the folded document directly into the front pocket of the sheriff's heavy canvas duster. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, thick with a dangerous electric tension that made the freezing air completely unbreathable. Callahan locked his piercing, steely blue eyes directly onto the sheriff's grim face. His gaze held absolutely zero hesitation, entirely devoid of the agonizing fear a normal man would display when faced with utter ruin. He was a man who had already lost everything he truly loved to an unstoppable, roaring inferno. The threat of losing a pile of hand-hewn logs, a few horses, and a meaningless patch of frozen dirt held absolutely no terror for him. The men in the East mistakenly believed his wealth was in the mountain. They were completely wrong. His entire world, his fragile, beautiful salvation, was currently standing on the porch wrapped in blue wool, and he would violently dismantle the entire territory before he let a single soul take her away. He leaned forward, his terrifyingly massive frame towering over the mounted lawman. He did not need to shout. The deep rumbling octave of his completely rusted voice was quieter than the howling wind, yet it carried an imposing, crushing authority that vibrated in the sheriff's chest. He stated, with absolute, terrifying finality, that the men in Boston could have the wood. They could have the dirt. They could drag the entire mountain down to the bedrock. But the woman was staying. He commanded the sheriff to ride back down the treacherous trail, to hiding in their wealthy mansions, and to inform them that if they wanted her, they would have to come up the mountain and pry her from his cold, dead hands. He slowly stepped back, turning his massive, incredibly broad back entirely on the heavily armed lawman. It was a display of such profound, utterly dismissive contempt for their authority that the deputies completely froze in stunned disbelief. He walked back to the porch, gently resting his massive hand on Evelina's trembling back, and guided her back into the warm golden light of the cabin, shutting the heavy oak door firmly behind them. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place with a deafening, terrifyingly final clack. Evelina stood in the center of the room, her delicate heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline of the standoff slowly receded, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying reality. He had done it. He had completely, irrevocably sealed his own doom. By tomorrow evening, this beautiful, fiercely protected sanctuary would be entirely overrun by federal marshals. He would be chained like an animal, entirely because he refused to surrender a broken widow. She turned to face him, the hot, uncontrollable tears finally spilling over her dark eyelashes. She choked on a ragged, completely devastated sob, begging him to listen, frantically whispering that he could not possibly make this catastrophic sacrifice. She pleaded with him to understand that she was entirely worthless, a ruined pariah completely undeserving of his freedom. She argued that Arthur was a monster who would never stop, a man who possessed limitless resources and a deeply cruel, vindictive pride. Callahan stood silently by the roaring stone hearth, completely ignoring her frantic, tearful pleas. He reached out, his massive hands grabbing a thick iron fire poker, methodically stoking the blazing logs, completely undisturbed by the apocalyptic threat hanging entirely over his head. When she finally ran out of breath, collapsing slightly against the heavy wooden table, he slowly turned to face her. His steely blue eyes were completely calm, entirely devoid of the agonizing grief she had witnessed the night before. He looked at her not as a fragile liability, but as the absolute, immovable center of his universe. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the floorboards. He stopped inches away, his towering frame casting her entirely in a warm, fiercely protective shadow. He reached out, his massive, heavily calloused fingers gently wiping a shimmering tear from her pale cheek. He spoke quietly, his gravelly voice completely shattering her frantic panic. He asked her, with completely devastating simplicity, if she truly believed he had survived the horrific fire in Oregon just to become a coward in Montana. He reminded her of the heavily scorched silver watch, silently communicating the profound, beautiful truth of his absolute devotion. He had failed to protect his brother from the flames. He would absolutely not fail to protect her from the cruel, suffocating fire of society. Giving her up was not a trade he was capable of making. It would completely destroy his soul, entirely extinguishing the tiny, fragile spark of redemption she had personally ignited within him. The profound, earth-shattering magnitude of his absolute love hit Evelina with the force of a physical blow. She stared up into his piercing blue eyes, the suffocating chains of her past trauma slowly, miraculously dissolving under the intense, blinding heat of his complete, unyielding devotion. She realized with a breathtaking clarity that sacrificing herself would not save him. It would completely ruin him. He was a magnificent, honorable giant who required a purpose, and he had entirely chosen her as his ultimate cause. If she surrendered, she would completely invalidate his courage, leaving him completely hollow and entirely alone in the freezing dark. A sudden, fierce, completely unfamiliar fire ignited deep within her delicate chest. It was not the panicked, frantic energy of a cornered victim. It was the quiet, diamond-like resilience he had constantly, silently nurtured since the day he lifted her trunk. She would absolutely not allow Arthur to win. She would not allow the cruel men of the East to destroy the only beautiful, pure thing she had ever known. She squeezed her haunted hazel eyes shut, desperately forcing her exhausted mind to reach back into the darkest, most terrifying corners of her memory, sifting through the horrific chaos of the weeks immediately following her husband's tragic death. Arthur had completely orchestrated her ruin. He had loudly claimed she was clinically insane, completely unstable, whispering vicious lies to the society matrons, ensuring she was completely ostracized and utterly destitute. He had loudly accused her of stealing priceless family heirlooms, a fabricated crime he used to justify completely freezing her bank accounts and violently throwing her out of the grand estate, with absolutely nothing but her mourning clothes. Evelina's hazel eyes suddenly snapped open. Her delicate hands grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table, her knuckles turning bone white as a terrifying, deeply buried memory violently surfaced. The heirlooms, the completely fictitious stolen property. She turned, practically throwing herself across the cabin toward her single, battered trunk resting in the dark corner. She fell to her knees on the rough floorboards, her small hands frantically tearing through the sparse, threadbare clothing, tossing her few meager possessions completely onto the floor. Callahan watched her entirely unexpected, sudden burst of frantic energy vacape ite hot, quiet, confused intensity, stepping closer to ensure she was not completely succumbing to the terror of the situation. She reached the absolute bottom of the heavy trunk. She ran her delicate, trembling fingers along the worn leather lining, pressing firmly against the heavy brass rivets near the corner. With a sharp, agonizing push, a hidden, entirely concealed false bottom violently popped open. She reached into the dark, incredibly narrow cavity, her fingers brushing against a thick, heavy package wrapped tightly in oilcloth. She pulled the heavy package out, her chest heaving with ragged, frantic breaths, and carried it directly into the golden light of the roaring hearth. She placed it onto the wooden table, her trembling fingers completely tearing the waterproof oilcloth away. Callahan stepped forward, his massive frame completely still, his steely eyes narrowing as he stared at the object revealed on the table. It was not a stash of priceless, glittering family jewelry. It was not a collection of stolen silver. It was a massive, incredibly thick, deeply worn leather-bound ledger. Evelina stared at the aggressive, gold leaf lettering stamped on the cover, a completely triumphant, entirely terrifying realization, washing entirely over her delicate features. Arthur had not destroyed her life, purely out of malicious spite. He had completely destroyed her because she was a catastrophic threat. In the chaotic, grief-stricken days following her husband's passing, she had accidentally packed this specific ledger from his private study, entirely unaware of its contents at the time. But Arthur knew. The cruel, incredibly wealthy brother-in-law had been systematically, massively embezzling millions of dollars from his own, incredibly powerful, deeply connected Eastern investors. He was running a massive, completely fraudulent financial empire, built entirely on stolen money and completely forged books. This single, heavy ledger contained every single piece of damning, absolute proof required to completely obliterate his wealthy facade, freeze his assets, and send him directly to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his miserable life. Arthur's frantic, desperate hunt across the country was not about retrieving a fragile widow. It was entirely about retrieving this book before she realized exactly what she possessed. She looked up at Callahan, her hazel eyes completely ablaze with a fierce, brilliant light he had never seen before. She was no longer a completely broken, terrified liability. She was holding the absolute, devastating weapon that could completely annihilate the monster threatening their sanctuary. She rapidly, breathlessly explained exactly what the ledger contained, entirely detailing the massive, catastrophic fraud her brother-in-law was actively committing against the most powerful men in the country. Callahan stared at the heavy book, a slow, completely dangerous realization dawning on his weathered face. The suffocating, impossible trap the Eastern elite had constructed around his mountain had a catastrophic, entirely fatal flaw. They had severely underestimated the quiet, delicate woman they were hunting. But Evelina's triumphant realization quickly shifted into a desperate, terrifying calculation. Possessing the absolute proof was entirely useless if they could not completely deliver it to the proper authorities. They could not simply hand it to the corrupt town sheriff. And they certainly could not use the completely compromised local telegraph office where the sneering postmaster would immediately alert Arthur's hired thugs. The territorial judge presiding over the region resided in the territorial capital of Helena, a brutal, treacherous 70-mile ride across completely unforgiving, snow-choked mountain passes. Callahan did not hesitate for a single second. The towering, heavily muscled rancher instantly grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the wooden peg, throwing the massive garment over his broad shoulders. He understood the absolute, deadly mathematics of the situation. He had to ride completely through the frozen wilderness, completely bypass the corrupted town, and physically place the damning ledger directly into the hands of the federal judge before the marshals arrived to entirely burn his world to the ground. He moved toward the door, completely intent on saddling his fastest, most enduring horses, preparing to undertake a completely suicidal ride through the freezing, demonic night to save their entire future. But as his massive hand grasped the heavy iron deadbolt, a sound completely froze the blood in both their veins. It was not the howling, shrieking wind. It was not the heavy timber logs settling in the bitter frost. It was a sound echoing directly up from the treacherous trail leading to the isolated ridge. The loud, aggressive, completely terrifying sound of 50 heavily armed men on horseback, completely churning the deep snow, violently breaking the pristine silence of the mountain. Evelina gasped, entirely clutching the heavy ledger to her chest, her wide eyes darting to the heavy oak door. The corrupt federal marshals, entirely bought and paid for by Arthur's limitless wealth, had not bothered to honor the sheriff's 24-hour ultimatum. They had not waited for sundown. The deadline was a completely cruel, calculated lie, designed to keep them completely trapped in the cabin. The incredibly violent, massive posse was completely surrounding the homestead right now, entirely cutting off any completely possible route of escape. They were utterly, completely trapped. You can always tell when a man has completely sold his soul to the highest bidder, because he completely abandons all concepts of honor, daylight, and fair warning. The deafening, aggressive crunch of 50 heavily armed men on horseback, violently churning the deep snow outside the cabin, was not the sound of righteous law. It was the terrifying, cowardly sound of absolute corruption. The federal marshals, entirely bought and paid for by Arthur's limitless, dirty Eastern wealth, had not bothered to wait for the 24-hour deadline they had so graciously promised the local sheriff. They had waited just long enough for the brutal, freezing night to completely swallow the mountain, intending to completely overrun the isolated homestead under the suffocating cover of utter darkness. They completely intended to drag the fragile widow away in heavy iron chains and permanently silence the massive mountain man before the territorial judge in Helena could ever hear a single word of the truth. The trap had viciously, completely snapped shut, and the heavy timber cabin was now entirely surrounded by a ring of heavily lathered horses and men holding cold iron rifles. Evelina stood entirely frozen in the center of the room, her delicate, pale hands gripping the heavy, leather-bound ledger. So tightly her knuckles shone a stark, bone white. The aggressive, roaring heat of the stone hearth completely failed to touch the absolute, terrifying ice violently flooding her veins. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the threat pressing against the timber walls was completely suffocating. 50 men. 50 corrupt badges completely intent on burning this fiercely protected sanctuary straight down to the frozen earth. The old, deeply ingrained panic of the subjugated city widow violently clawed at her throat, screaming at her to throw herself onto the rough-hewn floorboards, to hide, to beg for a completely non-existent mercy. She looked frantically at the heavy oak door, listening to the aggressive clinking of iron bits, and the low, cruel murmurs of the posse, completely cutting off any possible route of escape. But as her wide, terrified hazel eyes darted back to the towering giant standing near the doorway, the frantic, agonizing chaos in her mind completely evaporated. Callahan did not lunge for the heavy iron hunting rifle resting above the mantel. He did not pull the wicked hunting knife strapped to his thick leather belt. The massively built, imposing mountain man stood perfectly still, his incredibly broad shoulders relaxed, his piercing, steely blue eyes completely devoid of panic. He was a man deeply forged by the absolute brutal reality of the frontier, a man who had already survived the most horrific, agonizing inferno imaginable. The pathetic, corrupt posturing of 50 cowards hiding behind purchased tin stars meant absolutely nothing to him. He slowly turned his head, locking his deeply anchoring, profoundly calm gaze onto her pale, terrified face. He did not speak a single word of false reassurance. He simply took a slow, deliberate step toward the heavy iron deadbolt, his immense physical presence entirely dominating the small cabin, silently radiating a crushing, absolute authority that violently pushed back the suffocating terror of the night. Callahan grasped the heavy iron latch. He did not crack the door to cowardly peer out into the darkness. He threw the heavy oak door completely wide open, the heavy timber violently slamming against the log wall with a deafening, explosive crack that echoed sharply across the frozen ridge. The howling, demonic winter wind immediately rushed into the cabin, sending a blinding, crystalline swirl of snow dancing across the floorboards. Callahan stepped directly out onto the snowy porch, completely ignoring the freezing gale. Violently whipping his thick wool flannel shirt, he planted his massive, scuffed leather boots firmly onto the wooden boards, his incredibly broad, muscular chest entirely blocking the doorway, acting as a permanent, impenetrable wall of solid muscle and bone between the hostile world and the fragile woman inside. The immediate silence that fell over the posse was absolutely staggering. 50 heavily armed men, emboldened by their overwhelming numbers and their corrupt authority, completely choked on their arrogant sneers. The absolute second the towering giant emerged from the shadows. The lead federal marshal, a deeply unpleasant man wearing a heavy fur-lined coat and a tarnished silver badge, sat atop a massive black stallion directly in front of the porch. He had expected to find a terrified, easily broken homesteader. He had expected to shout cruel, intimidating demands and completely bulldoze his way into the cabin. Instead, he found himself staring up at a man who looked like an ancient, immovable mountain deity, a silent, terrifying predator, completely unfazed by the iron rifles pointed in his general direction. The sheer, colossal magnitude of Callahan's unyielding stance, the deadly, calculated calm radiating from his steely blue eyes, sent a violent, completely involuntary shudder, rippling entirely through the ranks of the posse. The lead marshal physically swallowed hard, desperately attempting to completely project an authority he suddenly did not feel. He leaned forward in his heavy leather saddle, his voice pitching into a loud, abrasive bark, completely attempting to slice through the howling wind. He loudly declared the premises utterly surrounded. He viciously demanded the immediate, unconditional surrender of the destitute widow hiding inside. Aggressively citing the completely fraudulent federal decree Arthur had maliciously purchased, he sneered, violently threatening to arrest Callahan for massive federal fraud, threatening to confiscate the entire mountain, threatening to completely obliterate the beautiful sanctuary if the giant did not immediately step aside. Callahan did not flinch. He did not shift his massive weight. He slowly crossed his thick, heavily scarred arms over his immense chest, looking down at the corrupt marshal with a gaze of such profound, utterly absolute contempt that the lawman's horse nervously danced backward. Callahan's silence was a crushing, physical weapon. He was completely, unequivocally refusing to recognize their purchased authority. He was silently, fiercely daring any single man in that massive posse to take one step closer to his porch, silently promising a devastation so complete and terrifying they would never see the sunrise. Inside the cabin, Evelina stood gripping the heavy ledger, her delicate heart hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against her ribs. She watched the towering, immovable silhouette of the man, completely risking his life, his freedom, and his completely isolated peace, entirely to shield her shattered soul. He was willing to stand completely alone against an army of corrupt men, entirely because he believed her fragile, beautiful existence was intrinsically worthy of absolute protection. A quiet, diamond-like resilience, the very strength he had painstakingly, gently cultivated within her since the agonizing moment she dropped her cracked comb, suddenly roared into a massive, blinding inferno inside her chest. She would absolutely not allow this magnificent, honorable giant to fall because of the toxic ghosts she had carried to his door. She possessed the absolute, devastating truth, and she refused to hide in the shadows for one more second. Evelina pulled the heavy, incredibly warm blue wool completely around her delicate shoulders, deeply anchoring herself in the physical reminder of his absolute love. She lifted her chin, her haunted hazel eyes burning with a fierce, completely unstoppable light. She walked directly toward the open, howling doorway, her bare feet entirely ignoring the freezing drafts sweeping across the rough-hewn floorboards. As she stepped out onto the snowy porch, sliding perfectly into the protective shadow directly beside Callahan's towering frame, a violent murmur of absolute shock rippled through the heavily armed posse. The men shifted nervously in their saddles, their cruel, expectant sneers completely collapsing into profound confusion. This was absolutely not the deeply unstable, completely insane, weeping pariah they had been heavily paid to retrieve. Standing before them, completely unshrinking against the brutal freezing wind, was a strikingly beautiful, entirely poised woman radiating an immovable, breathtaking dignity. Callahan did not push her back inside. He felt her delicate, fragile presence beside him, and the muscles in his incredibly broad back relaxed just a fraction, completely validating her magnificent courage, his imposing aura expanding to fiercely encompass them both. Evelina did not wait for the corrupt lead marshal to utter another venomous threat. She stepped forward, standing right at the edge of the snowy porch, the heavy leather-bound ledger clutched firmly in her small, delicate hands. She locked her intense hazel eyes directly onto the lead marshal, her voice completely devoid of the hysterical panic they desperately expected. Her tone was quiet, completely steady, carrying a sharp, crystal-clear authority that effortlessly sliced through the roaring blizzard. She demanded to know exactly who was funding this massive, completely illegal midnight siege. She did not wait for the stuttering lawman to answer. She raised the heavy ledger, the aggressive, gold leaf lettering, catching the wildly dancing light of the cabin fire. She began to speak the names. She did not speak the name of her cruel brother-in-law. She loudly, deliberately spoke the names of the immensely powerful, deeply connected Eastern senators, the massive railroad tycoons, and the federal circuit judges heavily invested in Arthur's completely fraudulent empire. She spoke the exact names of the very men who pulled the political strings controlling every single federal badge currently sitting on that mountain. The lead marshal's arrogant face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, completely terrified shade of gray. The heavy iron rifle resting across his saddle suddenly looked completely useless. Evelina's voice rang out with absolute, devastating clarity. She explicitly detailed the massive, catastrophic embezzlement documented within the heavy pages in her hands. She explained, with chilling, perfect precision, that Arthur was not a wealthy gentleman attempting to reclaim a sick relative. He was a completely desperate, cornered thief, attempting to violently retrieve the absolute proof that he had stolen millions of dollars directly from the most dangerous, powerful men in the country. She looked directly into the terrified eyes of the lead marshal, delivering the ultimate intellectual checkmate. She warned him that if he burned this cabin, if he destroyed this book, or if he harmed the towering giant standing beside her, he would not be serving the law. He would be completely protecting a thief who was actively robbing his own ultimate superiors. When those incredibly powerful Eastern investors finally realized exactly how much money Arthur had stolen, they would completely obliterate anyone who had actively helped conceal the evidence. The silence that crashed down onto the frozen ridge was completely deafening. The freezing wind seemed to entirely stop howling, the heavy snowflakes suspending in mid-air. The 50 heavily armed men sat completely paralyzed in their saddles, the horrifying, absolute reality of the political suicide they were currently committing crashing violently over their heads. They were corrupt, they were greedy, but they were absolutely not suicidal. They entirely understood the lethal, unforgiving hierarchy of Eastern wealth. The woman standing on the porch, looking as fragile as a winter branch, was holding a loaded financial cannon pointed directly at the absolute highest levels of the federal government, and they were completely standing in the crossfire. Callahan remained perfectly still, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his piercing blue eyes tracking the completely violent psychological collapse of the posse. He did not need to raise a hand. The fragile widow he had fiercely protected had just completely dismantled an entire army using absolutely nothing but her brilliant mind and the immovable courage she had finally reclaimed. The lead marshal physically trembled, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy ledger in Evelina's delicate hands to the utterly terrifying, completely unyielding mountain man blocking the door. The aggressive, bullying authority he had projected completely dissolved into absolute panic. He slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle, slipping it safely back into the heavy leather scabbard. He did not issue an order. He simply pulled hard on his heavy leather reins, turning his massive black stallion entirely away from the cabin. The movement broke the paralyzing spell. One by one, completely in silence, the 50 federal marshals holstered their weapons, turned their lathered horses around, and began the long, completely defeated descent back down the treacherous, snow-choked trail. They were abandoning the massive bounty. They were completely abandoning Arthur to the horrific, inevitable wrath of the men he had robbed. Evelina stood on the porch, her small hands trembling violently as the deafening sound of the retreating horses slowly faded into the vast, freezing abyss of the mountain. The suffocating, massive threat that had entirely consumed her existence for over a year was completely gone. It was not a temporary reprieve. It was absolute, completely permanent victory. She let out a long, ragged, completely exhausted breath, her delicate legs finally giving way beneath the overwhelming, crashing wave of sheer relief. But before her fragile knees could even touch the icy porch boards, Callahan moved. The massive, towering giant dropped his stoic, defensive posture entirely. His massive, incredibly warm hands caught her effortlessly, pulling her slight frame entirely against his broad, muscular chest. He wrapped his massive arms completely around her, entirely enveloping her in the heavy blue wool and the deep, anchoring heat of his colossal body. He buried his dark, bearded face into the crook of her delicate neck, his immense chest heaving with a profound, violently shuddering breath. He did not speak, but the absolute, crushing tightness of his hold communicated everything his rusted voice could not. He was thanking her. He was worshipping the magnificent, completely unstoppable strength hidden within her delicate frame. She had not just saved herself. She had completely saved his sanctuary, entirely validating the absolute, fiercely protective love he had poured into her shattered soul. Evelina dropped the heavy ledger onto the porch, wrapping her small, delicate arms completely around his massive, muscular torso. She buried her face against his thick flannel shirt, inhaling the deeply comforting scent of wood smoke, pine, and clean mountain air. The bitter, freezing winter blizzard raged all around them, but entirely within the massive, completely impenetrable circle of his arms. She felt a heat so profound, so incredibly beautiful. It completely melted the last lingering shards of ice in her heart. She was entirely safe. She was completely, unconditionally loved exactly as she was. The brutal Montana winter slowly surrendered to the aggressive, blindingly beautiful thaw of spring. The massive snowdrifts completely melted away, revealing the rich, dark earth and the vibrant, entirely unstoppable green shoots of new life completely covering the remote mountain ridge. The heavy, suffocating darkness of their shared past completely washed away with the melting snow. The heavy ledger had been safely delivered directly to the uncorrupted territorial judge. In Helena, the catastrophic fallout in the east had been absolutely swift and entirely merciless. Arthur's completely fraudulent empire had violently collapsed overnight. completely dismantled by the furious, incredibly wealthy men he had betrayed. The vicious brother-in-law was permanently locked away in a federal penitentiary, entirely stripped of his wealth, his cruel influence, and his false dignity. The massive, crippling debt Arthur had weaponized against Callahan's mountain was entirely invalidated by the federal courts, completely wiping the slate clean. The completely isolated, fiercely protected sanctuary entirely belonged to them, absolutely free and clear. Inside the warm, immaculately clean log cabin, the golden sunlight completely flooded through the small glass windows, entirely banishing the deep, blue shadows of the past. Evelina stood near the roaring stone hearth, her beautiful, ethereal face completely glowing with a healthy, vibrant radiance that entirely erased the haunted, terrifying pallor of the destitute city widow. The threadbare mourning clothes were completely gone, entirely replaced by a beautiful simple dress crafted entirely from the rich, heavy blue wool Callahan had purchased for her. She was no longer a fragile, broken liability hiding from the world. She was the absolute, completely undisputed heart of the mountain, a woman possessing a quiet, diamond-like resilience, completely anchored by the massive, towering giant who adored her. She reached up, her small, delicate fingers gently placing a fresh, vibrant bundle of wild mountain wildflowers into a small glass jar resting directly on the heavy timber mantelpiece. She paused, her hazel eyes completely softening as she looked at the two objects resting in a place of absolute, profound honor directly beside the flowers. Resting carefully on a small piece of soft leather was a deeply cracked, completely fragile tortoise shell hair comb. Lying directly beside it, entirely touching the broken edge of the shell, was a heavily scorched, completely ruined silver pocket watch. They were completely worthless objects to the rest of the world, completely broken and entirely discarded. But within the fiercely protected walls of this cabin, they were the absolute, most precious treasures in existence. They were the undeniable, beautiful proof that absolute trauma did not dictate the end of a story. They were the silent, magnificent symbols of two completely shattered souls who had deliberately, fiercely chosen to trust each other in the darkest, freezing abyss, entirely forging a profound, unbreakable love that completely saved them both. Callahan stepped through the open oak door, the warm spring breeze completely swirling around his incredibly broad, muscular shoulders. He had completely shed the heavy canvas winter gear, wearing only his work trousers and his thick suspenders over a light cotton shirt, the deeply tanned, weathered skin of his massive arms glowing in the sunlight. He stopped completely in his tracks, his piercing, steely blue eyes instantly locking onto Evelina's beautiful, smiling face. The completely dangerous, deeply intimidating aura that usually defined his massive frame was entirely absent, completely replaced by a vast, incredibly deep ocean of absolute, completely unguarded tenderness. He walked slowly across the rough-hewn floorboards, entirely ignoring the heavy timber tools resting near the door. He reached her side, his massive, heavily calloused hand completely swallowing her small, delicate fingers in an incredibly gentle, completely anchoring grip. He did not say a single word. He did not need to. He simply pulled her completely against his immense chest, resting his bearded chin entirely on the top of her dark chestnut hair, completely enveloping her entirely in his vast, protective shadow. Evelina closed her eyes, listening to the slow, incredibly steady, completely magnificent beating of his massive heart. The world outside the mountain could continue its completely chaotic, cruel spinning, entirely obsessed with wealth and hollow power. It completely did not matter. She was entirely anchored in the deepest, most profoundly safe place on earth, entirely protected by a towering, magnificent giant who completely believed she was the absolute greatest treasure he had ever found. You see, my friends, the world is absolutely full of people who will entirely try to convince you that because you have been completely broken, you are completely worthless. They will loudly demand that you hide your cracked edges and completely apologize for your trauma. But true strength is completely entirely found when you absolutely refuse to listen to their cruel noise. True strength is setting an immovable, completely unbreakable boundary against the ghosts of your past and entirely realizing that you are deeply, intrinsically worthy of a love that fiercely protects you without ever demanding you shrink yourself to fit their completely fragile egos. If this completely unexpected, beautiful journey into the freezing heart of the mountains resonated with your own quiet resilience, please take a completely quick second to like this video and absolutely subscribe for more completely emotional, profoundly healing Western romances. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the help of AI tools and has been carefully edited. All rights reserved.